Well, hello there, everybody. At some point, I suppose this is all going to feel routine again, but after all these years, it's really good to see you, especially to have you in the House Republican Caucus. I'm glad so many of you were here. I was very interested in the governor's address. I've sat through 13 of these now, and it's a little depressing that in general it's been the same stuff for 13 years, 10 years for this governor, and it felt quite good that he was, in many cases, providing solutions that had been proposed by House and Senate Republicans. And so perhaps after a few years of flailing away at things like public safety, they recognized that serious mistakes were made and that the solutions that were proposed by our two caucuses made sense after all. And there's certainly things that we're going to join in along with him to support. And then you may have noticed there's a few things that we're probably not going to support. I guess the thing that always strikes me about the governor is he knows he has a number of topics that he's responsible for as governor, but his voice really changes when he gets to carbon. And, we are a diverse state. We're a state that has a lot of challenges, and as he pointed out, a lot of advantages as well. I think one of the most important things that, I'd like to remind the governor, it's about a lot of things besides carbon, and we need that enthusiasm in our other challenges as well. I probably am a little rusty in this. I should have introduced everybody here, but of course I'm super proud to have my longtime colleague and House Republican floor leader, Jacqueline Maycumber, and Assistant Floor Leader, Representative Peter Abarno, who you just saw provide another set of awfully good solutions. And I will turn it over now to my friend and colleague, Senator John Braun.
All right, well, thanks, JT, and thanks, everyone, for being here. It is very nice to be back in person. Still getting used to it a little bit, and I am proud to be here to discuss the issues we're working on here in the legislature and take your questions. And grateful to be joined by my friend and colleague, Judy Warnick, who is our caucus leader, also by default our deputy leader. I'm going to stop there because I'm much more interested in answering whatever questions you have. So let's go to questions.
We've heard the governor talking about his housing proposal put out to a referendum, and what would be the Republican proposal on what to do on getting more housing construction this year to get done in this session?
Well, I will defer to my floor leader here first, I think.
Well, funny you should mention that. We were just discussing that, and it's nice to see you in person. It's been a while. So we really need to talk about, we've been on the floor and we've been discussing for many years now, at least the time that I've been here, a lot of these policies are going to increase the cost. They're going to increase the cost. Some of those being the recent energy, looking at building homes, you have to have plug-ins and certain things that really have increased that cost, and we're looking at a projection for a single-family dwelling up to $30,000. And that really limits the building. So we really need to talk about, okay, let's talk about limiting those high energy, those high costs, and really moving into building and private sector. You're going to see a lot of these cost analysis that are just so much higher than it would be just a regular building per square footage. And you'll see that it'll be shocking. We've put approximately $1 billion in the Puget Sound area for homelessness, and we haven't really seen any more units built. So how is that going to really look into the future and the governor's plan to actually units built and people helped? And we would really like to see that plan moving forward. Peter, go ahead, what you were suggesting earlier.
Well, and I think when you look at the cost of housing, I think you look at process is a big part of it. But also there's this antiquated notion that to increase housing units, you just plop a house on a piece of property, and that's just not how it works. In communities like mine that are in poorer communities that are a little older, that need infrastructure, there is a lot of work, expensive work, that needs to be done prior to even affordable housing being built. I think the focus on above ground should come after we start talking about infrastructure. And things like taking money out of the Public Works Board, out of the capital budget, and using it for other projects was a mistake, because if we want to focus on housing and we want to reduce the cost of a house or even rent we need to build units. And to build units in a lot of communities outside of the Puget Sound, and maybe even in the Puget Sound, starts with infrastructure. And that to me would be where the focus needs to be. But I think we need to really look at permitting. We need to look at growth management. We need to look at density. And there's a lot of other issues that we can look at before we start spending billions of dollars, $4 billion over 6 years, on programs that are already proven to not work. We haven't been building units. So just throwing money at a program without showing that you're actually going to increase housing, I think is a mistake. I think we should go back to basics. We start looking at infrastructure first.
Just a show of hands, does anybody support the governor's idea to borrow that $4 billion? Would you vote for that proposal?
Well, let me say, I think that it's a proposal that's well meant, and I'm looking forward to the hearing process, hearing from the state treasurer on viability in terms of our credit rating, and it's not the worst suggestion that's come. Will we support it? I want to listen to testimony and go through the process on this.
I would say put it this way. I mean, we have a real problem. We ought to be listening to problems we like and or solutions we like and solutions we don't like, and being open-minded about it. I would tell you, just based on the math, his proposal doesn't work. It just doesn't. We have a shortage of somewhere between 250 and 300,000 homes in our state. He claims that with $4 billion over 6 years, he can build 20,000 homes. There's no evidence to say he can do it. To start with, the average affordable home is well north of $400,000. His math, he's got half the money he needs right now, if he had $4 billion. So the math by itself doesn't work. Plus, we have no history in our state of folks taking affordable housing dollars and doing better than expected. It's always come in, worse than expected. On top of that, we have, record high inflation. So there's very little mathematical evidence that this is going to work. That said, as I began, we ought to be listening, we ought to be open-minded, we ought to be willing to do things we're not completely comfortable with, if that's reciprocated, if he's willing to have the discussion that says, if we're really going to solve this, let's involve the private sector. There is absolutely no way to build the number of homes that we need without involving the private sector and private sector development. The math just doesn't work. He threw out the number of 1 million homes needed over the next, I think, 18 years, somewhere between here and 2040, I think is what he said. 1 million homes. And to suggest we're going to pay for that by the state is just ridiculous. Do the math with me. Let's all do some math exercise. Average price of $400,000. That's a little low right now. Times 1 million homes is $400 billion. This is not a problem the state can solve by itself. We need to engage the private sector. We have to open up, land for development, both with density and with extending our UGAs and our city boundaries. We have to do the things that Representative Marnos talked about by building the infrastructure, create the environment, do the things, set the stage so the private sector can come in and build at an affordable rate and sell at a rate that our citizens can afford.
And I'd also like to, I'm sorry, Judy.
No, I was just going to say, to add to that, to encourage home ownership by folks, along with the private sector. In my community of Ellensburg, I represent Ellensburg. We're putting up a Habitat for Humanity neighborhood. It's working very, very well. We're building houses with the help of the folks that are going to be moving in there. And I think if we look at that a little bit at a time, we're not going to solve King County's problems, but we're working with King County Habitat for Humanity to be able to do that. So look at outside the box a little bit. Maybe look at condo ownership. So people have something at the end of the day that is an investment for their family.
There's also a very fertile crop of bills in the House right now that are more promising than any I've seen before, because they tend to have both Republicans and Democrats in the top two sponsorships. And you've heard me talk a few times about how the ideological conflict has blown housing bills up over the last few years. And I've asked that we talk about solutions that we can agree on first, and worry about demonizing people that provide housing last. And I think actually I've got some hope that that's going to happen. And so I'd look at the House and Senate bills and take a look at how many Republicans and Democrats who are very serious people are sponsoring these together.
I have a question.
My name is Renee Gans. I'm from WNPA. So you mentioned that many young people can't afford where they grew up. Currently, with being a young person entering the housing market, it's extremely difficult. Most young people are resulting to renting and not able to have a house under their belt within the 10 years. What are you going to do for young people in regards to the housing market?
Well, I think one thing that you've seen, some of the people that have been here for a long time have seen is Republicans over and over talking about making more dirt available, more developable lots. And you do that by deciding that, the Growth Management Act isn't inscribed on marble tablets, that it can be modified and you can increase the amount of building space that is available, which is the most basic part of housing affordability. And it's taken 20 years to get to the place that we may be at now, and you're hearing both sides talking about let's create more flexibility. Sometimes for environmental projects, you heard the governor talking about making permitting easier. That's a Republican idea. I was happy to hear him say that. We can talk about the same flexibility when it comes to making more building spaces available. And if you look at the middle housing bill that is sponsored by Republicans and Democrats, a little controversial in places, it is all designed to increase the supply of housing, and that's how you reduce the cost of housing, is by having more housing available.
You talked about some of the policies that you, like public safety, for example, as one of the things that you're a little bit frustrated that Democrats and Inslee are finally paying attention to. What are some of those other policies that you see turning around that were originally Republicans' ideas that are now being implemented or proposed?
Well, I'd love to share more of these with my Senate colleagues, but I think you kind of were asking me that. And so mainly I was thinking about public safety. We went backwards in public safety a few years ago, and some of our most divisive debates had to do with things like the value of police and should we have more funding for police. There were those, as you know, that talked about doing a lot less funding for police. They rolled back the ability of police to enforce the law and to stop people. You've seen rollbacks in terms of penalties for gun crimes, for example, rollbacks in terms of penalties for the most dangerous drugs. Those were mistakes. And almost every proposal that you see now, whether the governor's proposed it or whether they were bills that passed last year that fixed some of the problems and bills that may pass this year, had already been encompassed in House and Senate Republican amendments to the original public safety bills that provided those rollbacks. And I've said over and over, you in the press and we in the minority in some ways have the same job. Our job is not to pass bills because we're not able to do that. That's what the majority does. Our job is to point out the mistakes, and if they're smart, they will use that to prevent themselves making mistakes. Well, they didn't do that. And I blame the remote sessions for a lot of that. It was so hard for people to get the attention of those who were going to win all those votes. This time we've all got a chance to make a bigger impact, and we should be partners in doing that. We have the same job in this case. I'm sorry, John. I want you guys to answer too.
I would second some of them. Certainly in public safety, Blake, if you look at the proposals being shared right now, they very much reflect the Republican written bill that was passed out of the Senate in 2021 that ultimately got side railed. So you see the same thing along the pursuit lines. You see regional criminal justice training academy training centers. Republican idea for over 10 years it's been on and off from Republicans. When it comes to education, you heard the governor talk about finally getting after properly funding our special education students. This has been a Republican idea for years. We've been pushing to get that right, to make sure we're properly funding special education. And more broadly, education. We're hounding the fact that we have not done enough for learning loss. We've been doing that for 3 years. Finally, folks are starting to pay attention to the fact that 1 in 3 students test below grade level, that we used to have a top 10 K-12 public education system here in our state, and now we're average and falling. They're finally paying attention. And these are things we've been working on for years, and they're policies we've been working on for years.
We have if you look at House Bill 1013, that's my policy on pre-apprenticeship programs in high school, and I believe we have the sponsorship up to over 30 members, both Republican and Democrat. That's a policy that gives children a pathway out of high school that may be in the trades, and so that allows every student in the state of Washington to have somewhere to go when they graduate, and that's hope. I represent a poor rural area outside a tribal location, and kids need hope when they leave high school. Not everyone's going to college, and to make sure that every kid has those opportunities. And so you see a lot of bipartisan work happening when we talk about education and opportunities for the future. We need to do what's best for our children to move forward and have the next step in their lives and have that go straight into whether that's skills or their career or the future into college. And so we're really excited about that policy moving forward and getting a hearing. And including the law enforcement bills when we talk about them, this is something that we've been talking about for some time, that ratio, law enforcement officer per ratio. And so it is encouraging to hear the governor talk about that policy. Last year, I believe it was 1362 was a policy I had regarding a pilot program to have mental health experts right along with officers. They've done it in some areas in the Puget Sound area, but it would be really nice to expand it throughout Washington state. It was once again nice to hear the governor talk about the needing critical response for mental health at the time of the incident, which is one of the most important moments, that when they're having a mental health crisis, that response is happening. So it's encouraging to hear the future and working together from these policies, especially when it's ideas that you've had over the years and now seeing them implemented, whether they're Republican or Democrat. But I look forward to these policies moving forward.
The one that I would agree with the governor on, and he just briefly mentioned it, was the 988 program that is being implemented. I worked some on that with the CRIS committee, Crisis Response Committee. I especially am interested in helping our rural communities. We have the highest suicide rate in agriculture and rural areas. And if we can implement the 988 system in the way it's envisioned and include people who understand what it's like to live in the rural areas, then we're going to be helping not only people who are older, but our young people avoid suicide. So.
The governor ended his speech with two topics that got Democrats out of their seats, but not Republicans. I'm pretty certain I know that there'll be no Republican votes for a constitutional amendment on abortion rights, but could you maybe confirm that if that's accurate? And then secondly, on the gun safety, are there any Republican votes or support for working on a bill that would require safety training for an individual before they buy a gun? Just that concept, how does that play in your caucuses?
So abortion first, I would say, and I've said this over and over, I don't see a need for a constitutional amendment. The law has been in place since 1970, passed by the people of the state of Washington, modified by the people of the state of Washington in an initiative in 1991. I don't see a path where that changes without a vote of the people. You can game it out, and there's no real path, no matter who's in the majority, there's no real path. So I think the people have spoken, and we're going to respect the will of the people. And whether there's votes or not for it, I can't tell you. Unlike the Democratic Party, there's no litmus test on this issue in the Republican Party, and there never has been. You saw the Senate Republicans in the majority for 5 years, from 13 to 17. We didn't pass a single abortion bill. There's a reason for that. We don't have the votes. It's simple as that. And it's true at a national level, too. When you talk about all the rhetoric, all the political talk about this, there's not the votes. So why, and when you look at the polling, this isn't what's affecting people's lives the most. They seem to understand more than politicians do that this isn't what's affecting their lives. It's public safety, it's affordability, it's education. Those are the top issues, and that's what we're focused on. When it comes to gun safety, I'd tell you this. I'm willing to have any conversation with them about gun safety if they're serious. If they're serious about changing our environment, because guns are only a small and inanimate part of that problem. Are we going to talk about families? Are we going to talk about mental health? Are we going to talk about substance abuse? Are we going to talk about social, emotional well-being of our students? Are we going to do all the things that contribute to violence, whether it's gun violence or not? If we're going to have a serious, grown-up conversation about that, I'm all in. But what I hear from the governor is just, it's just political speak for, let's make everything about gun violence because that's good for us politically and bad for our opponents politically. And that's not a serious conversation about changing people. He's talking about changing things. Changing things is easy. Changing people is hard. And if they're willing to change our environment, our communities, our state, I'm all in. But that's not what they're talking about right now.
I guess I would say the one part of his speech that I really reacted negatively to is when he said that he'll do anything to keep people more safe. And you reflect on the public safety bills that I already mentioned that clearly made people less safe, and the fact that there's been rollbacks of penalties having to do with gun violence. They're not talking about doing everything to keep people safe. They're talking about the things that are most divisive.
Speak about the Blake decision, path forward, and what the conversations are in your caucuses there in terms of, so the framework there and where you might see common ground with the Democrats.
Yeah, I think the path forward, it's going to be a little tricky, frankly. And I can speak specifically to the Senate, where the chair, Law and Justice, has a decidedly different view, certainly than our caucus, and with much of her caucus, and that she wants to pursue a decriminalization path. That's not the path that most people in the state of Washington support. It's not a path that most of the members of the legislature support. I think it's much more likely to be something along the lines of what was originally passed out of the Senate on a very bipartisan basis. In 2021, that was a proposal put forward and then negotiated with the majority, where we passed it on a bipartisan basis. And it looks something like we do step back from the felony issue, that while there's some value in drug court, I don't want to dismiss that. The idea that there's ultimately more harm than good, but we can't just make it no cost. We have to involve the justice or the criminal justice system at some level, because they are going to be involved no matter what you do. They are the ones out there on the streets. They're the ones that are going to interact with folks who are addicted to these substances. So we have to involve them, and we have to look for ways we can get folks into treatment. I think there's a lot of agreement broadly that we're not here about reinventing the war on drugs. We're trying to get people into treatment and keep them in treatment, but also a growing recognition we can't do that outside the criminal justice system. So it's going to be a framework that says, hey, there are penalties. I think right now, if I was guessing, I'd say the landing point is a gross misdemeanor, but there's some series of deferrals or required treatment, and it ratchets up over time. So we say you've got to get into treatment, and if you get into treatment and you're successful, great, that's super, that's what we're all trying to get to. If you're not in treatment, that ratchets up over time, so we have a bigger lever to get people and keep people in treatment. I'd like to think that's where we're going. That's what I'm hearing from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, but we got a lot of work to do.
We have quite a few policies, some that are just separate and bipartisan. Look to protecting children, mostly. The decriminalization of drugs really ended up throwing it out there, and really concerns about the next generation that are seeing it in front of their schools, their elementary schools, and their parks. And so making sure we protect children, especially on those really hard drugs, right away. There's some policies that are going to be coming forward that is bipartisan on that issue. And then also we do have a bill that just directly looks at the gross misdemeanor of really going back and looking at the criminalization of some of these most difficult drugs to get hooked on and suffer from. And this is really, as we see every day, we're seeing mothers and fathers and children lost to these drugs. And so really, this was not the most humane thing. There was not an infrastructure to protect people who needed help and wanted help. And so now we need to look at, with the decriminalizations of these drugs, how do we look at helping the people that are suffering from it? And I believe we have a bipartisan effort to make sure that happens. And that is something that Republicans were fighting for when this first started. How do we help the people that are suffering on these drugs?
So just to, I guess, clarify and go off of what you just said, it sounds like you guys are open to keeping it a misdemeanor. You're not just strictly going toward the felony charge. Is that?
Gross. Well,
Yeah.
and so I learned a lot. As a former law enforcement officer, I've been learning a lot through this process. When it is a felony, you have, standardized sentencing guidelines. And when you make it a gross misdemeanor, you have a little more leeway in the judicial branch of the government to see how to assist people in that way. And we're willing to work together and say, okay, how do we work through this process? I know there is policy that is felony, and I know there is policy coming that is gross misdemeanor. I'm the sponsor. So I know there's different ways that we're looking for the options, and we want to make sure that everybody has the options available in the judicial branch to help everyone at this point who is suffering.
Yeah, I think what you're going to see is a lot of cooperation on this. If it fails again, it'll become very political, I suppose. But I think the truth is Republicans and Democrats want to get this right, and we're trying hard to find a place where you can get majorities to do it. And what I would hope, honestly, is if it's hard to get 50 Democrats on a single policy that is effective, that they will give up their idea that you have to have 50 Democratic votes to bring anything to the floor, and find a way to bring a bill to the floor that might be a felony or a gross misdemeanor that could get 70 votes, but it would be a lot of Republican votes that would be part of getting that. This is a place where there's just too much humanity involved to let it be political, and I'm pretty sure that almost everybody is feeling exactly that way about it.
We've got time for one more question.
Representative Abarno talked about investing in education and early learning and child care to expand, opportunities for working families looking for child care. Do either of your caucuses have specific proposals along those lines?
I'd say the most powerful proposal on child care right now is for the state to step back from, we've waded in fairness, in a bipartisan way on early education over the last 10 years in ways that have not necessarily been helpful for the access and affordability of child care. The best proposal, I think, out there is a simple one that increases the rate. Because what that does is that it doesn't change the standards, it doesn't complicate the cost, the access to workforce, access to facilities, and by changing the state paid rate, that means it not only helps the people who are using the state services, it also averages down the cost for the private side who are making up the difference. This is the single best way. It's a very simple solution, elegant solution that actually gets at solving the problem without making it worse. And that's what we got to do, is we have to have the humility to say, look, we did this, I think, for the right reasons. We want high quality child care for our children, but by putting standards in there that drove the cost up, that made workforce unavailable, that literally closed down child care centers across our state. I used to tell people I drove by 5 closed child care centers between my house and my normal job every day for several years. Some of them have now been turned into other things, but they're all still there. We drove them out of business because we made the standards unachievable and unaffordable, and what we could do more than anything else is for the state to pay its fair share and get out of the way of private side child care providers doing their job.
Thank you very much, everybody. It was great seeing you. Come back again soon.